If he doesn't come back by Tuesday, we get clapped.
Hello and welcome to SATB 219. What you just heard there was, of course, the live performance by the Plastic Ono Supergroup from December 15th, 1969 at the Lyceum in London. And that was the core Plastic Ono band, John and Yoko, Klaus Voormann, Alan White, as augmented by Delaney and Bonnie and friends, which included Eric Clapton, who had been in the Plastic Ono band previous, as well as George Harrison, as well as Keith Moon and assorted others from the traveling Delaney and Bonnie show. That would be Jim Price and Bobby Keys on brass, Keith Moon along for the ride somehow. Apparently, Billy Preston was there at the show, but didn't make it onto the tape. And when John remixed the track for inclusion in the Sometime in New York City, he brought in Nicky Hopkins to lay down an electric piano part to fill that space. Anyway, I think that's pretty much all the players there. But best I can tell, it is the only recording to feature George and Eric and John on the same track. So there you go. The three that we're going to be discussing today, their 1970 works. So there was an article published last year, late last summer, on Medium.com in the run-up to the 50th anniversaries of All Things Must Pass and Plastic Ono Band. And of course, in this COVID-driven year, we didn't get to experience those things on the proper 50th, but we did eventually. Plastic Ono Band, that set came out in April this year. We've got All Things Must Pass coming up. It was written in the spirit of the commemorations of the proper issue date 50 years ago, last November and December, respectively. But one that didn't really get much play last year was the 50th of Layla, which came out November 9th, 1970, the same day as Badfinger's No Dice. So it's kind of interesting that two separate groups of musicians that both worked on All Things Must Pass delivered works on the same day following that. In any event, Kyle wrote this piece that I thought was a really unique take on those albums. Now, on SATB in its previous lifetime, there was a show done on Plastic Ono Band and All Things Must Pass, comparing and contrasting, because that just sort of lends itself, given the time frame they came out right on top of each other, Spector's involvement with both. And anyway, this was, I thought, a very unique take, adding Clapton and Layla to the mix. And it resulted in this article that, if you have not read it yet, I would strongly urge you to do that. God, Love, Pain, and Identity. How three relationships forged the three most human albums of 1970. Written by today's guest, Kyle Driscoll. And I thought it was a very fascinating and fresh take. And so I strongly urge anyone who hasn't yet to check out that article on Medium.com. It's easier for you to Google Kyle Driscoll than to try to put in that title. But in any event, I did post it on my social media, so take a look for it. And it really serves as a insightful look at the way these three artists, who were in each other's pockets at that time, each in a similar situation where they're sort of breaking away from their past identity, the burden of their past identity as they felt it, and what they were aspiring to, what they're running to, and fleeing from. I just thought it was a very, very interesting take on things, and you can read it for yourself, see what you think. But that was sort of the point of me reaching out to Kyle and getting him to come on the show, was to flesh it out. I think it's safe to say he's the youngest guest I've ever had on SATB. Make of that what you will. But his take is pretty fresh as well, so I think it's a good one. Anyway, you will hear lots of stuff from those albums in 1970 generally, and that bit at the opening was, of course, John within minutes of George walking out of Twickenham January 10th, 1969, which will be very interesting to see if we get to get the visual that went along with that in the upcoming Peter Jackson. Stay tuned.
He got a call just before he joined Genesis, and he was in a group called Hickory, and then he was a group, I think, called Flaming Youth, I think it was. And somehow he knew Ringo Starr's chauffeur. And George Harrison just started making with Phil Spector. That's how showbiz works, all contacts. With Phil Spector, he started making All Things Must Pass, and he wanted a percussion player on the track Art of Dying. And Ringo's chauffeur said, "Oh, I know this guy, Mrs. Collins' boy. He's a percussionist, he's a drummer. You get him along." So Phil Collins was hired as the conga player on Art of Dying. And he's not a conga player, and, he's a drummer, and therefore, all day of playing congas on this thing, the old fingers are bleeding. He thought he wasn't doing a very good job. But anyway, he said when the record came out, he rushed out and had a look to see if he was on the credits. There's no mention of him in the credits, and he listened to the track and he couldn't hear the congas. And of course, years later, he meets George Harrison and he tells them the story. And George Harrison, they became quite good pals. I think they were working together. George Harrison said, "Do you know, that's interesting, because I think I've still got the tapes from that recording somewhere. I'll go and dig them out and see if I can find your conga playing." And Phil said, because I always really wanted to know who, it must have been Phil Spector who just said, "That guy isn't good enough, let's sack him."
Yeah.
So anyway, a week later, he gets a call from George. Said, "I found it. I'll send it right over now. It's absolutely amazing. We can hear your congas and everything." So he said he puts it on, and there's and they're really awkward and quite bad. Is the conga part, very, very audible. And he listens to this and thinks, "Christ, that is pretty shocking. I'm surprised they're not surprised they didn't use it." Then he hears George Harrison's voice saying, "Can we try it again, Phil, without the conga guy?" So he thinks, "Oh God, so it was George Harrison." And he rings up George and he says, "Oh God, I listened to the whole thing and I hear your voice at the end." And George goes, "Really? How embarrassing. What did I say?" And he tells him, And then just a pause. And then George says, "Actually, I'll be honest with you," he said, "I dubbed all that on." He said, "I found the tape. I got Ray Cooper in, and I got Ray Cooper to just play really bad congas. And then I did this little thing at the end saying, let's try it again without the conga guy." I thought that is such a great story. I love the idea that he's put so much effort and energy into this one gag just to amuse himself and to stitch up Phil Collins. I thought it was so funny.
You're a youngish guy compared to a lot of us that have been doing this stuff forever and ever. So how long did you have like a familiarity with these records before you started really thinking about them and then weaving this thesis together?
So not a lot. I was born in the 90s. My parents had all the classic rock, greatest hits CDs and stuff growing up. So I've just always been a fan, but never really dipped into the solo careers until really maybe a few years ago when I was in my early 20s. Mm-hmm. And then I think I knew obviously the Paul Wings hits and My Sweet Lord and stuff like that. But it really was just about a couple years ago that I started listening and realizing how impressive and singular these albums were.
Right.
Especially Plastic Ono Band. I knew kind of about the anger with Mother, the screaming at the end and whatnot. But realizing the entire album has that singular statement was really eye-opening for me. And I think just the connections started happening organically. Can't say what prompted it, but it really fascinating once the gears started to click.
Well, when I came across that article that you wrote, I couldn't believe it because I obviously am closer to the connection when these albums were new. I had older brothers, and so I didn't hear Plastic Ono Band for a long time. That didn't come along until I was discovering the Beatles on my own, going through their catalog, and then going through the individual albums. And I'd read some things about it before I actually got to hear it. I'm thinking mostly Tyler and Carr, Beatles Illustrated record. Uh-huh. So it sort of prepped me for it. But I certainly didn't have any knowledge of it, never heard Mother on the radio or anything like that. Layla, I had a certain amount of familiarity with, certainly the title track, some of the other cuts. And then we had All Things Must Pass in my house when I was a kid, but seemingly there was only a few cuts that got played by the people who owned them. So I had to dive into that over time again when I was discovering and going through the catalog of the Beatles. But I think in your case, you have a real leg up in that you're so far removed from the Beatle myth. I grew up when the Beatles were still this monolithic, big, huge, all-encompassing thing, and there was still sort of a sadness associated that now they weren't together anymore, and maybe they would get back together. So that was sort of the cultural environment that I was discovering and absorbing this stuff through. Whereas you come to your thesis where the material is relatively fresh to you. Yeah, you grew up in a household where this music was accessible, but once you start to listen to it as an adult and you don't have the decades of mythology attached to it, you're hearing it like relatively fresh music. I think that was able to give you an advantage in coming up with this notion, tying these records together the way you did. So kudos for that. I'm always looking for an original take on stuff that for a lot of us is very familiar. And boy, you nailed it. And like I was telling you by email the other day, your article came out whenever it came out, like, what was it, like fall last year or something like that?
Yeah, around that time, I think.
Yeah, and that was where I reached out to you, and then things happened. And so we had to wait till spring to convene. But rereading it again, it's like, Jesus, this stuff is so smart and compelling. I don't want to overhype something because readers are like, oh my God, I'm expecting this and it's just this. But no, really, it's a really smart take. So if you would, for the benefit of the listeners that are hearing this, not having read it yet, and they will because it'll be linked to, but kind of lay out your forming this connection between these three very personal, very singular releases that have a bit of Venn diagram overlap between them that all came out roughly in, what was it, the same quarter of 1970.
Right. Well, first of all, thank you so much for your kind words on the piece. And it's really an honor to be on here talking with you about it. I'm a huge fan of the show.
No, thank you.
I think that may be true that I have a unique frame because I didn't have all the connotations of growing up through the 20th century. You know, by the time I was cognizant of this stuff, there were only two Beatles that were surviving. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe that helped. But essentially the article, or what I was writing about, it all revolves around, as you said, this really incredible rock year of 1970, where you essentially have some immortal rock release coming out essentially every other week, it seems like.
Sure.
Paranoid, Bridge Over Troubled Water, all these classics. Mm-hmm. I wanted to look at three in particular, which, as you've mentioned, are Lennon's Plastic Ono Band, George's All Things Must Pass, and Eric Clapton's, through Derek and the Dominoes, Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs. Mm-hmm. And so these three albums are released literally within a month of each other, right, in November and December 1970. And they are released at this very pivotal time, you know, certainly culturally, but also, you know, personally for the three guys, and a very pivotal time, especially in their personal relationships with each other. Mm-hmm. And so my, you know, thesis, so to speak, is that these relationships between, you know, Clapton, Lennon, and Harrison form this kind of triangle of influence that helps to shape and guide the works that they ended up releasing and recording at this time, which, as you've said, are just these singular, vibrant statements, lyrically as well as musically and thematically. Mm-hmm. And so all of those great singular works are in many ways founded on those relationships between the three guys.
Yeah, it's astonishing because one of the commonalities among the many you've woven together is that they're all coming at pivotal moments in these men's lives. John and George, certainly, their first post-Beatles releases, and Clapton, who is post-Cream, post-Blind Faith, and really trying to figure himself out, mm-hmm, being the guy worshipped as God, mm-hmm, as you point out in your piece. And, you know, there's this undercurrent. God pops up in all three releases, one form or another, and just trying to figure himself out. And in the face of this great personal travail, being in love with his best friend's wife. Right. So it's a remarkable confluence that in each case, in all three of these musical statements, each artist had to get something very personal off their chest.
Yeah, absolutely. And that personal thing, as you've just hinted at, is sort of symbolized by these other two guys. Mm-hmm. So if you take Clapton as an example, Cream is done. And John, when the Beatles break up, and all the Beatles are really about doing their own thing, self-promoting their new, you know, individual material. Mm-hmm. Clapton is taking a step back. He's trying to get out of the spotlight, it seems to me, by just being a guitarist for, you know, Delaney and Bonnie, Blind Faith, actually George's album in the studio.
Right.
And he goes to the extreme. And one of the ways that he can do this, or one of his enablers in this goal, is John,
right,
who back in the Rolling Stone rock and roll circus, obviously played with the band with him and Keith Richards, but also in Live Peace in 69, mm-hmm, it's John and Yoko's show, and he just lets Clapton just kind of play some blues songs as a guitarist.
Right.
And so he has John kind of being one of many enablers to his desire to get away from being God, as he is branded, as he said. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, as many rock fans know, that's not the only thing bothering him. Even greater, perhaps, is this intense unrequited love he has for his friend's wife, who happens to be George Harrison, mm-hmm, which is just an incredible circle that is formed. And so you have those two forces from kind of Lennon and Harrison. And what do they produce but this album that is, first of all, he totally sheds his identity by literally the record company is pissed because no one knows that Derek and the Dominoes is actually Eric Clapton's band.
Right.
So he sheds his identity to that extent. And every song is just these almost pathetic pleas for this mystical Layla woman's affection.
Yeah. It has the anguish that Plastic Ono Band has, mm-hmm, in a different direction. And furthermore, to extend your point about Clapton, who has had this association, this pedestal he's been put on as a god for his guitar playing, what does he do across the 2 discs of Layla but delegate it to Duane Allman?
Yeah.
A lot of the lead playing is Duane Allman.
Absolutely.
Instead of grabbing the spotlight for what he's best known for, he takes a step back from it.
He takes a step back from that. And also vocally, I think there's a case to be made that he is sort of outperformed by Bobby Whitlock on a lot of songs, who's just wailing away. I don't know about his pain, but I'm sure he had quite a bit.
Right. It's always channeling Eric's. Absolutely.
Right. And to top it all off, one of my favorite songs on the album is the cover of Little Wing by Hendrix, who passed away recently, I think, at this point.
Very recently. That was September, and I think they're recording this. I think it started in August of 70. It's like right off of his work on All Things Must Pass. They rolled right into this.
Right. So I don't know if he had died when they recorded it, by the time they recorded it. But if he had, it almost seems like it's this exulting tribute to the guy who is now enshrined as the martyr of guitar, the god, essentially, of guitar, and remains so to this day.
Right.
So that's a great point about him stepping aside with Allman, and I think it even goes deeper than that to these other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's a guy who is not built for the spotlight the same way other people are. In Cream, you got 3-star players that are all musically battling for the spotlight. I think Eric was quite comfortable letting Jack Bruce take the lead vocals most of the time, and Ginger certainly liked his space, but calling such a personal album, giving it the identity of an alter ego, that's a statement unto itself.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially since he had actually released an album under his own name, literally called Eric Clapton, earlier that year as well.
Yeah.
And so
it's sort of like a phantom Delaney and Bonnie album, really.
Sure, yeah. And that's a good album too. I'm not as familiar with it, but yeah, there's something just so personal about this one, and both anonymizing himself and making this kind of folk figure out of the woman who was Pattie Boyd in reality.
Right.
Is Layla. And that's kind of laid into by that great cover art of this mysterious woman. So the whole thing is really cloaked in mystery, which is, I think, like almost the opposite of what you could say about the other 2 albums and in how personal they are.
Yeah, it's funny. He takes a step back from associating himself, Eric Clapton, the man, with it. But at the same time, he's creating the mythology of this profound love affair with the painting and the Layla, and evoking whatever it was, a Turkish love story from the 13th century or something like that, whatever it was. It's like he's having it both ways. He's putting on the table this grand mythological love story, the same way John and Yoko did from day one until the day he died. That was like,
right.
So they've got that thread in common as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a great point. Because I feel like if at least one of the things that people know about Eric Clapton today is that, oh yeah, that song Layla is about George Harrison's wife.
Right.
So it's funny how, yeah, that's in anonymizing. He maybe intentionally, I don't know, intentionally or not, created a significant part of his folk legend, which is kind of fascinating.
Right. And Pattie Boyd's identity in the rock audience mindset as this great muse.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of people think that something was written expressly about her, which George has sort of denied, and then sort of, well, fine, if that's what you want to think, then you can think that. But I think at best he was ambiguous about that. But certainly there was other songs, maybe not the same status of a Layla, that Eric very much did write about Pattie. Wonderful Tonight, most people know about. But then there's a later one, The Shape You're In, from Money and Cigarettes album, that she saw as him being cruel because it was not a very flattering song about getting your life together when they were going through their personal issues. That's the identity that's followed her. This was ground zero for where that became attached to her as rock's great muse. And it doesn't hurt to have this blonde, blue-eyed woman on the cover of this album.
Right. It is kind of a funny postscript to the lore that they did end up getting married 7 years later and then divorced like 10 years after that.
Yeah, it's very
I don't know if it maybe ruins it a little bit with the mystique. And I honestly don't know that much about that era in their personal lives. I don't know. I know she has a book that
as does he.
Yeah, I may read at some point, but definitely the fact that Something and Wonderful Tonight, among others, are tied to her as well, as whether or not they should be. It definitely has cemented her place in rock history for sure.
Yeah. So you've got Eric then between position of John, who has basically had an Eric fixation since Rock and Roll Circus. Would have known him before that because George brought him into the session for While My Guitar Gently Weeps in September of 68. December, they actually played together. And then 10 days into the Get Back sessions, George takes a walk. Within minutes, John's throwing on the table.
If he doesn't come back by Tuesday, we get clapped.
And that's like his go-to as a surrogate for George, funnily enough.
Yeah, that is a great point. And I'm now kicking myself that I didn't mention it in my article because that is so true. It took him, a half hour less to immediately offer a replacement for George, and it was Eric.
It's funny. He seems to be having this rock and roll circus flashback after George walks out because not only does he gravitate toward Clapton, but before that, he sits down and starts playing Soon Be Home from A Quick One while he's away.
Right. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it's just, he was having some nostalgia that day or whatever. Well, I don't know if it was a year after, maybe 6 months after.
No, it was weeks after. That was December 11th.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's literally like a month to the day, more or less. And of course, Michael Lindsay Hogg is the commonality between the two projects.
Right. Yeah, well, he probably wasn't having that much fun in the Get Back sessions themselves, so I guess he had to reminisce on the maybe more fun era. But
when you go to September, the Toronto thing, I don't know if you know this, if you'd mentioned it or not, I can't remember, but the first call John made when Toronto landed on his plate, like, how would you like to come out? And he says, well, I'll come out if I can play. He called George first.
Oh, wow.
And George is like, he said, no way. And he would say later, I knew it was going to be one of these avant-garde kind of things, and I wanted no part of that. So the second call was to Clapton.
Yeah, that's funny. And kind of ironic, seeing as George did end up playing on a lot of John's material from after that point.
Yeah, half the Imagine album plus the Lyceum cold turkey avant-garde Don't Worry Kyoko supergroup with Delaney and Bonnie.
So there you have it. But the live piece is interesting. I was not aware that he called George. That's really interesting. But either way, Eric is who he ends up playing with.
Right.
And is it true that either to or from that was when he told John told Alan Klein that he was going to break up the Beatles or leave the Beatles?
That was what his story was in hindsight, was that I knew on the way over to Toronto that I wanted out of the group. Now, if you look at the timetable of things, I think that was September 13th was the gig, and they were flying out on the 12th, and maybe the offer came that day or something. It was all very, very fast, like within 24 hours, something like that. But the famous, what's been called the 4442 meeting, the tape meeting at Apple, which was on the 10th, this is John sitting there with George and Paul. Ringo was absent. That's why they were taping the meeting. And he's proposing for the next Beatles album. We carve it up between us. You get 4 songs. I get 4 songs. George gets 4 songs. And Ringo can have 2 if he wants. And Paul's demurring on that. He doesn't want to be restricted because he's the guy with the most to lose under that kind of regimentation. And also John's proposing a Christmas single, which is a pretty funny thing. He doesn't literally mean a Christmas song, but a song out by year's end by the Beatles, which is in the history we know of John through the years saying, I wanted out of the Beatles since 1966, since we quit touring or since Brian died and I knew we were finished, all this stuff. It's interesting to hear him in real time just before he does a 180, as he's wont to do with the Toronto thing. Okay, I guess I want out of this after all. And even at that, in the Beatle inner circle, because they did manage to keep him quiet about it between Klein and Paul, well, don't go public. Apparently, they didn't tell George right away. And that is a pretty good indicator of how seriously they took it, knowing John, who is just as likely as not liable to change his mind the day after that. And you look at the rest of the year, that he's doing the most high-profile Beatling out of all of them. Look no further than the Christmas record, or him wanting to put a couple Beatle tracks out as a Plastic Ono Band single, and all these tons of interviews he's given. It's hard for me to believe a seriously committed to leaving the Beatles John Lennon wouldn't make an event out of it or let it slip. I think he was definitely ambiguous about the whole thing.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm glad that he finally got his desire to have a Christmas song released a couple years after that. Happy Christmas.
Yes, a literal Christmas song.
So essentially, it seems that the claim that he was sure that he was going to leave the Beatles during Toronto is certainly revisionist, and likely he certainly was not adamant in any direction.
Right. Just as coming off the heels of that, when they recorded Cold Turkey, and his whole thing was he offered it to the Beatles and the Beatles said no. In later tellings, he would describe it as, well, it was too personal or too heavy for them, blah, blah, blah. But at the time, and of course he's given a million interviews around then, he says the timing wasn't right and I just wanted it out. I didn't care who recorded it. And you look at what's the Beatles' perspective, they're about to drop Abbey Road and George's first A-side. And for them to record and rush release, as John was wanting to do, a song that has nothing to do with that album, and that, by the way, is going to kind of step on George getting his first A-side, it didn't make any sense. And I think had he not been so wanting it out on impulse immediately and could have waited to the end of the year, early January, then the Beatles probably would have done it.
Yeah, right.
But they weren't ready to at that time, and he put it out himself, and it slipped down the charts, so he gives back his MBE, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's a funny part of the story. I'm kind of glad that they did refuse to put it out personally, because I feel like Cold Turkey is just better as a John Lennon solo song than a Beatles recording. They had more than enough great material that year. But yeah, I mean, his state of mind seems fairly erratic during this entire time, which eventually compels him to go off to Arthur Janov. And I'm not sure if you may know more details about like how he had heard of it or how he ended up there, but it certainly is just another in a long line of hopes or salvation idols, essentially, from just acid in general to Maharishi to Yoko and heroin, that tandem.
Right.
And to me, and this may be a far field of the conversation, but to me, that all is going back to one of the best quotes he ever made, which you've quoted often on your show, which was in the Maureen Cleave interview in 1966, where he said, at the height of his commercial and like really artistic success, he says, whatever I'm meant to be doing, this isn't it for me.
Right.
And so you can kind of see all these things culminating in Janov as just a series of attempts to try and figure out what that thing is, that what is the answer to the statement he posed in the Maureen Cleave interview.
Exactly right. Yeah, you see that pattern. Janov being the latest in a series of the next big thing / daddy figures, is another way of looking at it.
You're sure.
In the absence of Brian, who clearly occupied that space in John's psyche. Yeah, he's all in whenever that comes along. My impression, I believe, if it wasn't Janov himself, it was maybe the publicist that sent the copy of the Primal Scream to John in early 1970. And his plans, I guess, for the spring, with the Beatles sort of not doing any Beatling at that time, was to do an album with Phil Spector in the wake of Instant Karma. And to that end, he had started writing material, some of which ended up on the next record, some of which ended up on Imagine. It's interesting that if you're more of a casual than a hardcore fan, and you know that John underwent something called Primal Scream therapy, and you also know there was a period he was doing a lot of screaming on records, you might presuppose that Cold Turkey was a result of Janov when it actually preceded it.
That's a great point, right? It's definitely feasible to link the screaming on Cold Turkey and the screaming on Mother.
Yes.
But one has the Janov influence, one doesn't. Also, it is, if you think of it in context, Cold Turkey is this kind of experimental demonstration of withdrawal symptoms, or however you want to interpret it. Whereas the Mother screaming is more in line with the idea of the Janov therapy of, conjuring up, and not that I'm an expert on this, but from what I understand, conjuring up the painful, traumatic memories of your past with this screaming primal urge. And so if you think of it just, okay, he's screaming, like, well, he also did that all through the Beatles' life. So, but if you think of the context, there is, I think, a disparity. Yeah,
you're exactly right. That is a distinction that I think it's like people who look at Yoko's body of work as nothing but screaming. And there's a certain amount of nuance within that screaming if you want to look for it. But that's another conversation for another day.
Yeah, I might have to do some preparation if we're diving into the nuance of Yoko.
Study the lyrics carefully.
Maybe someday. Someday.
Yes. So you've got that going on, that Janov comes along at this very pivotal moment, because then when the Paul press statement with his debut album comes out, and it gets spun as Paul quits the Beatles are no more, and him privately expressing, but I quit back then, and why didn't you report it, Ray Connolly? Because you told me not to.
Right.
Well, damn it, you're the journalist, and I should have done what Paul did. I should have used it to sell a record. He's full of that regret about it. I think his hand got forced because even though Paul wasn't saying he quit the Beatles or the Beatles were no more, I guess it just depends on the definition. At the time that happened, it blew up in his face. he was taken aback that I didn't say I quit the Beatles, but then now that we're airing our dirty laundry, he tells Ray Connolly, I didn't leave the Beatles left the Beatles, and each one of us had quit at one time before. You have that Life magazine quote from the November 7th issue where he says, the Beatles thing is over, which is a very ambiguous statement when you look at it beyond, what do you mean? The group split up? I don't think that was really what he was saying, and certainly didn't get reacted to in real time. I think people were just relieved to find he was still alive and not dead, because that was the context of the interview. But I think what he was saying there aligns with sort of their actions and quotes around that period of late 69 going to 70, where they're sort of taking a step back from each other. They're not going to be the four-headed monster anymore, but they're definitely leaving the door open.
Yeah, the key word there is the Beatles thing is over.
Right, writ large.
Like the thing of business as usual as we've been for the last few years making records and before that touring.
Yes.
But yeah, it's very clearly different from saying, oh, the Beatles are broken up. And the other thing I just thought of, and this is kind of tied to the article in terms of the part about identity, is that it's very ironic that John had always accused Paul of being the PR maestro.
Yes.
When Paul clearly, like, repeatedly failed to garner public support and had an enormous backlash against him.
He's shooting himself in the foot repeatedly during this time.
Right. Like, there is no way that he should have received the amount of blame that he did for the breakup.
Right.
And yet he has it in multitudes.
Yes.
And yet somehow he is the one pulling the strings with the public. And people, as you've covered a lot in the show, totally believed, every word of the Jan Wenner interview with John for decades to come, which is just madness in hindsight.
It is. And the thing is, John himself was shrewd enough to realize in real time, this is me talking one day. I'm likely not to feel this way again tomorrow, but don't you dare put this out as a book. And Wenner got his publishing hat on. It's like, you damn well better believe I'm putting this out as a book. This is dynamite. And you probably heard that interview when John was hanging out with George at the end of the Dark Horse tour, and George is doing a radio interview and John's there. And they actually bring up Lennon Remembers.
Right.
And John tries to explain it away using the metaphor, when you hurt yourself and you say, ow, in that moment, it's how you felt right then. I think he was kind of sick of talking about it by then, because there was a certain amount of backlash at the time, certainly from George Martin for some of the things that were said. I think John recognized he spewed in the moment. And if we talked about it on the show before, it's one thing to read it in print, but another thing to actually hear his voice when he's saying it. And it actually doesn't come off as harsh or as black and white once you get the tone of how it's coming out of him.
Yeah. No, I think I've heard some of the clips from either your show or elsewhere. And it's definitely like, where's the vile and disgust in his voice that comes out when you read it? It's not there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But it's funny because, he says repeatedly then, I didn't mean to say all these things about Paul or whoever, or George Martin or whoever, like it was touching a stove and saying, ow. Mm-hmm. And how can you not connect that to his going back and forth on whether he wanted to break up the Beatles or not?
Right. Absolutely.
Like it's the same erraticism or wishy-washiness, however you want to put it.
Count me in, out.
Yeah, right. Very complex figure, undoubtedly, which is why one of the interesting things with Plastic Ono Band, one of the theses, I guess, in the article is that his first real attempt, free of the Beatles, to kind of answer that question posed in Maureen Cleave. And it's very clear that he did not find an answer then. Mm-hmm. And I doubt he did find an answer in his lifetime, which is sad to think about. But just hearing some of the kind of obsession tour of father figures or intended salvations seemed to continue. Mm-hmm. And he seemed to actually embrace like a lot of the things he denied in the litany on God.
Oh, yes.
So it's kind of too bad. He had that album really served as kind of an attempt to figure it out or at least reconcile with it. And the next year he was back to kind of sugary pop with Imagine, at least for some of the albums. So I don't know if he really found an answer.
Right. Yeah. I think that given where he was at the end of his life, and again, there's the public posturing, the public utterances, and as Aaron Weber would have it, you have to look to the context. Well, who is he talking to and what is he doing? Oh, he's selling Double Fantasy, a joint album with him and Yoko. And therefore, you've crafted this narrative. Our life is completely holistic. We don't need anybody else. This is it. We're completely self-sufficient. I'm baking bread and raising the baby. Yoko's handling the business, blah, 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 blah. That's the public posturing. when we know the reality was considerably different from that. To me, it would have made a more interesting record if he'd speak to that.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's what you get with a John Lennon. In 1970, in the fall of 70, when he's recording that record, this is it. I don't need the Beatles. I don't need these constructs that hold so much sway and influence among the masses. There are certain things that he puts out that do stand up as just profound observations, maybe not directly applicable to him. One can make the case. I remember when I first read the lyrics, Working Class Hero, keep you doped with religion and sex and TV. That's a statement for the ages, because that's never changed.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Working Class Hero is definitely maybe the least personal song on the album, especially since, isn't it kind of pointed out that he wasn't really from the working class? Like he kind of grew up with Mimi, who was more middle class.
Absolutely. The other Beatles certainly came from more depressed circumstances. And Mimi was a very comfortable environment and home she gave him. He was going off to art college straight out of taking his school exams, which he didn't do very well at. But a house filled with literature where culture and literacy were very much impressed upon you. Not the kind of upbringing he would have had at all had either one of his biological parents raised him.
Right.
Then he might have been a true working class hero in that regard. Although some people wanting to, I don't want to say apologist because that's maybe too harsh of a word, but he described himself as instinctively socialist, meaning he had empathy for the lower quote unquote classes. And I could see that as having a certain amount of validity. Although then what do you make of, as Elton John himself made fun of John for living in the Dakota? There was that parody he sings to the tune of Imagine about entire flats for fur coats and shoes and all that stuff. Where's the materialism that you eschew? When does that begin?
Right. That's hilarious. I've never heard that.
Oh, yeah.
That's incredible. No, it is interesting. I think he grew up in the kind of house that Paul was given in his 20s with the Ashers. I don't know if that's a fair comparison to draw.
But certainly in terms of cultural enrichment, absolutely.
Right.
That's a great parallel. It's like he got that, Paul got it later in life than John did.
Yeah. And so it's interesting to see, because Paul sort of, to my knowledge, never came out with any like working class anthem type music or even really touched on social issues in general that much. Whereas he had actually come from the world and sort of made it to the other side. Whereas John, I mean, you have this album, you have a ton of Beatles songs like Revolution or what have you. And then the Sometime in New York City album, which is kind of, I guess, the last gasp of a lot of the political stuff.
Yeah, but overtly, for sure.
It's interesting. Although I wrote an entire article being one, I try not to play armchair psychologist too much. so it's hard to say this caused this, but it's just interesting to note, I would say.
It really is. It's there in plain sight because John Lennon, of all rock stars, put his psyche out there on the table for examination. His public analyzing himself and laying bare stuff at great personal risk. It's funny, we were talking in email, you were listening to Who by Numbers, and I had this revelation. Is this Pete's Plastic Ono Band? Because he is taking this great risk for the first time in a while, not hiding behind a character, a Jimmy or a Tommy.
Right.
And absolutely speaking to his disenchantment with being a rock star and losing his place in the world and all this stuff in a way that I think the utter bleakness of it was hard for a lot of people to accept. And that's why you need a squeeze box on it to sort of lighten the load a little bit, some comic relief. I think that is an album that reeks of despair. It's every bit as daring on a personal level for him as I think Plastic Ono Band was for John.
Yeah, I basically just kind of really started listening to it recently, and that is an absolute masterwork. And because, exactly like you said, you have Tommy, then you have Who's Next, which was originally Lifehouse. So he was planning on doing a concept album again. Mm-hmm. And then Quadrophenia, obviously. So the last time he was doing something personal might have been a Quick One album, or I guess Who Sell Out would have been before Tommy.
Yeah, there's glimmers of it there, like Sunrise and Our Love Was, I Can't Reach You.
Right.
To the extent they can be read as personal.
It's certainly a lot, I would say, objectively more fun to listen to than like a Plastic Ono Band. Although I mean, I do really enjoy the music on Plastic Ono Band.
Yeah.
Like these are some really rockin' tunes on like really,
sure.
It's just 10 for 10 incredible songs. But lyrically, I actually almost conceptually, I absolutely get the Plastic Ono Band comparison. Mm-hmm. If you look at individual lyrics, it almost reminds me of some of Layla's, because there's kind of like these pathetic lines, or like sitting around drinking. I think there's some weird, like some kind of odd sexual lines that you're like, that's kind of weird that would be like that he's just saying this. And that kind of reminds me more of Layla, because this is where Clapton's over the whole album. He's like, he references being on his knees begging, like,
yeah, crawl across the floor for you.
Yeah, multiple of times.
Yeah.
Or a multitude of times.
And it's funny, because that's like the complete self-humiliation of somebody in the face of what it is he's desiring. When I think about that, somebody of Clapton's position expressing that about himself, you want me to crawl across the floor for you? You want me to beg you to take me back? There's that line in, I think it was in Lennon Remembers, John says, one has to completely humiliate oneself to be what the Beatles were, and that's what I resent.
Oh, wow.
It's like he's made it through the other side, and looking back at it now, all those compromises I made, all those things I did saying, please love me. Look at me, I'm dressed in a suit now. Will you love me now? That kind of thing. And he's a guy that, again, going back to the armchair psychology, clearly craved some kind of feeling of love and security that he absolutely did not get in his formative years. Even though Mimi clearly loved him, she was just hard on him. It wasn't maybe the kind of way he wanted to be loved at that time. And that was what made his mother so attractive, because she was fun, encouraged the anti-authoritarian side, and then Yoko is like the embodiment of both sides.
Right.
Fun, let it all hang out, John. But, it becomes this mother may I thing by the end of his life.
Yeah, right. It's interesting that I guess Mimi, whatever she offered wasn't enough for him, apparently.
It wasn't warm.
Yeah, absolutely. What you have just kind of laid out as like years of humiliation, as he put it, I guess, and the Beatles is kind of what I see as the tie between him and George, where George symbolizes this kind of little brother figure who for years, even though this isn't actually true, George sought freedom, as much as John did from the Beatles, but he symbolizes the guy that followed him around as kids, and he's not letting his older brother grow up and move out of the house.
Yeah.
And that's the force, in addition to Clapton's enablement of his solo performances in Toronto and what have you, that kind of formulate his singular statement as this totally not self-absorbed, that has too negative connotation, but self-indulgent, I guess, and exploratory album with Plastic Ono Band.
Yeah, it's funny. I just came across that quote the other day. I'm trying to remember where it was. I was reading where he was talking about how I don't call people, people call me, or else we don't connect. And he used the example of when one by one after that first Hamburg trip, first George gets kicked out of the country, then Paul and Pete get arrested and they get kicked out of the country, and he's kind of languishing on his own for a while. Stuart's already decided to stay there. Then he leaves and comes home and is sitting home in Liverpool for several weeks without picking up the phone because this just wasn't his nature. And then when he did reconnect with Paul and George, they were mad at him, like, why didn't you call us? And he then, in that moment, as he's relating this anecdote, says, because I'm just too self-absorbed. Yeah. And he kind of laughs as he says it, but at least he had the self-awareness to recognize that he was the kind of person that, as we know from going back to Hunter Davies' book or wherever else you want to go, he had to be the leader of the gang around him. Mm-hmm. And the Beatles were content to be those satellites, then to varying degrees of co-equalship. George never got that from John ever, but he certainly aspired to it for the longest time. And that was why you have that confrontation that we talked about on the show with Duncan Driver in 74, where there's on the Dark Horse tour and him and John have it out. And he's like, I did everything you wanted me to do. Where were you when I needed you? Mm. I think the breaking point might have been the Bangladesh concert, which is coming right off the heels of him contributing to half the Imagine album. And then John ultimately balks at sharing the stage with him for that event.
Right. It's 1974, and these resentments held from their teen years are bubbling up, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Did Paul have a reason for not playing at Bangladesh, or was he not asked?
No, he was asked, and his whole thing was, well, it's silly to get together when we just broken up. He said something like that, sort of glib. But then his bigger point was, I'm not going to give Alan Klein the opportunity to say, I brought the Beatles back together.
Yeah.
And the following year, when John did the 1-to-1 show, and I guess ticket sales were a little sluggish, he called up Paul, who had just finished a tour with Wings in Europe that month, and said, hey, fancy joining me on stage? And he was tired, but also with Klein still in the mix, he wasn't going to do that. But he did get asked, and John would have liked to have done that opportunity with Paul at that moment, which is a really interesting thing.
Yeah. So it's really just the utter contempt or even like hatred of Klein by Paul that seems to have just he never got over. And I wonder if maybe part of it is linked to Linda, because Klein from the beginning was kind of presented as like the opponent of the Eastman family, which is his family now.
Right.
But it's crazy to see how that one factor was just so strong for him. It's kind of fascinating when there's so many other variables to consider.
I think that was ultimately the poison pill between them, because that's where you have the 3-to-1 split. The last thing Paul wants is anybody telling him what to do. And you've got Klein being the guy that's, first of all, turned 3 of the Beatles. He's got them in his pocket, and we want nothing to do with the Eastmans. In fact, we're going to fire him as of April 18th or whatever it was in 69, where they took him out of the mix completely. I would love to know, because I don't think anybody anywhere that I've seen has done a really detailed exploration of the backstory between Klein and Eastman's preceding Klein coming to the Beatles, because I suspect there was some bad blood in New York between them even before the Beatles were on their radar that informed the animosity they had toward each other from the get-go.
Okay, yeah, I'd be interested to hear that. I think maybe you mentioned on maybe one of your conversations with Aaron Weber that, or maybe elsewhere, that no one had yet to do like a really sound biography of Alan Klein.
Yeah.
I think for the importance that he has in the Rolling Stones story and the Beatles story in the late 60s, I think that would be a really fascinating document if someone were to do it right and try and be unbiased and objective. That would be an incredible resource.
Yeah, not do a hagiography like the one that was done.
Yeah. I'm not too aware of that one, but I can only imagine.
Well, it's when it happens, it's the problem with trading access. We're going to give you access to the files and everything we've got. However, you get a certain amount of implicit, if not explicit, control of the narrative that comes out from it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And she covered that subject very well. I just finished her book, actually.
Oh, yeah.
Beatles and Historians. That was a great read. Anyways, I think we have covered John and Eric. Should we start on George, perhaps, with All Things Must Pass?
Yeah, I think we started to. The whole him not wanting the big brother to move out of the house because he's not gotten that validation from him yet.
Right.
And in the case of John Lennon and George Harrison, he never would.
No, yeah, which is sad. And the flip side of that, of course, is that John was sort of the oppressive big brother to George. Like almost cruelly, it seems, through at least the later years of the Beatles, just not even caring to participate in the George recordings. And you can't look at it objectively and say like, well, he was right to, because the songs were inferior. Like they definitely were not. Even before Abbey Road, I would say a lot of his White Album material is obviously Gently Weeps, but also Long, Long, Long and Savoy Truffle are like some of my favorite Beatles songs probably.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so, and the fact that those guys couldn't care to record Gently Weeps until Clapton was part of it is just mind-blowing, given the pop songwriter minds that they are.
Yeah, you have to wonder number one, what was clouding their ears at that point, but also the psychology of their being incapable of accepting his equal status as an artist in a way that John was completely welcoming to Yoko Ono as an equal and producing Don't Worry Kyoko as the greatest rock and roll record since Great Balls of Fire or whatever, that kind of thing. But he could never accord it to George for whatever reason. Paul, you've got sitting feet away from George during that Apple meeting of September 69. Well, up until this year, your songs weren't quite as good as ours.
Yeah.
It's like, what the hell? And it's something we've talked about on the show before is the weird thing where George affixes his loyalty to the big brother that isn't very kind to him, but the one that is, that will work on his songs and help develop them. You're hard to find a kind word, especially after 1970. Never be in a band with Paul McCartney again, but I'd join a band with John Lennon any day. What's the psychology informing that? I'd like to know.
Yeah, that's really weird because with that, I think they had been friends prior to like the Beatles and to meeting Lennon. So that, I think it's just the guys that you know the longest, you probably get the most annoyed at. And obviously there was a period of high annoyances. Right. And that John was always kind of this more of an idol figure, whereas he probably saw Paul as more of a peer. So when the peer elevates the older brother and is like, don't play this on Hey Jude or whatever, or Let It Be, that's just so much more grating.
Yes.
I mean, again, that'd be just from my own experience, my guess. But
I think you're exactly right, actually, in terms of what any of us who has siblings, especially brothers, knows of what those relationships can be like. That absolutely makes sense. If you look at them, George was the youngest, so he was already kind of used to that role. And maybe he saw the Beatles, or starting with the Quarrymen, as an escape from that situation where he doesn't always have to be the perpetual baby brother. He can shine. Look, he's got an exceptional talent on lead guitar. So they're giving that to him, that role to him after Paul blew it. And Paul is never shy about reminding him of the pecking order.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure after John's death, they got closer and came back. I know by the time of George's passing, they had repaired their relationship mostly, but it is kind of crazy to see that the tears from those few years did seem to overshadow a lot of their personal relationship from then on out. Especially since John was so much more condescending. Right. And like literally, like I don't think Paul ever openly said like, yeah, me and John were the only thing that mattered in the Beatles. Whereas John seems to have at least implied it on multiple occasions.
Yes.
And so why doesn't he have the same antipathy towards John? Right. I think maybe that's just that he felt like Paul was more of a peer.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. May I have another?
Yeah, sure. So,
and I do think that when George was clearly taking a step away from what John perceived as his hero worship of him, and suddenly it wasn't there, where he calls him out in 74. And I think they were capable of that point once George had spewed and gotten it out of his system. I don't think he had much of a problem with John at that point. John's quote was something like, I know what pain looks like, so I let him express it. I let him have it out. But then there's a couple of years after that, there's that questionnaire that somebody sent to John for the one-word answers. You know what I'm talking about?
Remind me.
I can't remember what he said for Paul, but it's something complimentary like, excellent or great or something like that. For George, lost.
Right. That's right.
Yeah. And it's like, he's lost because he's taken you off your pedestal. Is he lost? Because, 76, George was a great place. And maybe John's thinking was a little behind the times because in 74, he was kind of lost.
Right.
That was his lost weekend.
Yeah, sure. With the Dark Horse tour and whatnot. I think that All Things Must Pass, the album, was so huge towards leveling the playing field, where George had finally gotten, first of all, just all these songs. I mean, if you're a songwriter, each song is like your baby. And just to have these actually be listened to by the public and not be limited to 2 songs on an album by John and Paul, that's big in one sense. But also, I believe if you're just looking at it commercially, the 3 albums in question, All Things Must Pass was by far the most successful commercially.
Yes.
You've got the #1 single with My Sweet Lord.
Yeah, What Is Life was the top 10 single in the States, for sure.
Sure. Rightfully, I might add. Can't believe that wasn't a #1. So just getting those credentials, it's like you could kind of rest easy and be like, okay, I proved my point.
Yes.
I proved that I can do this. Everyone knows I'm not the backup guitarist. Everyone knows it's totally wrong when John says Paul and I were the Beatles. The other guys were just, filler.
Yeah.
And then obviously the altercation in 74, like actually airing the grievances. That would be the sense I would get from George.
That he got the validation he'd been seeking from his older brothers.
Right.
And finally the world gave it to him.
Yeah, right. Which he probably sought, like all of his very spiritual focus on life and fascination with the God aspect, as we've said, is a recurring theme, that the material external validation, I would say, seemed to mean a lot to him. And I definitely don't blame him for it.
Right.
If you can write songs like that, like the album of 15, 18 amazing songs, then you should want recognition for it.
Right. The dynamic he experienced when he went to America and the holiday time at 68, where he's hanging out with Dylan, who he always revered, and the band, who are, I guess they were a group that the Beatles collectively, at least Paul has also expressed positive things about them, and Ringo was a fan. I'm not sure about John specifically, but George really appreciated the egalitarian spirit within those guys, and them saying, you're a great guitarist, a great songwriter, wow, you should do more. Comes into the Twickenham sessions on that high still, and immediately gets brought down to earth. There's been a little bit of revisionism recently about the song All Things Must Pass, where there's that Pop Goes the 60s guy saying, well, the Beatles, they didn't shit all over it. They gave it a time and attention. Well, yeah, they worked on it a lot. They didn't end up ultimately developing it enough to record it. But there's also any number of instances on the Niagara reels of every time George brings in a song of John shitting all over it. That happened time and time again. I Mean Mine, or he tries to steer them into rehearsal For You Blue, and John goes, get off, and goes back into the white power thing. It's like he's clearly getting this in-your-face disrespect at a time when his expectations have been heightened, where other artists that he cares for are respecting him. There was the quote from Clapton, I don't know if you've ever seen it, where somebody asked him, well, would you have ever stepped in for George if he'd left the Beatles? And he says something like, I would never join the Beatles. They're so mean to each other.
Yeah, that's funny. And even in response to the guy you quoted, even less overt, like just shunning or rejection of his material is like, well, sure, they played, I'm no expert on the Niagara reels, but they played All Things Must Pass. But they're playing Get Back for hours and hours on end.
Yeah.
And like Don't Let Me Down from when it was just this droning, like one chord song that John brought in.
Yeah.
And so you're spending hours and hours on that.
Yeah.
And not this objectively just gorgeous and actually thought out completely song from George. You can't help but see that as a tacit rejection, if not an overt one. It always makes me, I actually love the Let It Be album as released, obviously produced by Phil Spector, which we haven't noted. He also produced Plastic Ono Band and All Things Must Pass, very interestingly. But I love that album.
And also the first Derek and the Dominoes single.
Oh, is that right? Phil Spector.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
They rejected it. Tell the truth and roll it over.
Wow.
Yeah, there's a take of that. Yeah. And then they went to Miami and worked with Tom Dowd and rejected the Spector one.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. But as much as I love the album, I feel like if they just took some of the songs a little more seriously, it could have been so much better. Like if you could sub in All Things Must Pass for You Blue, like that is a major upgrade. And even some of the singles, like if Don't Let Me Down was on it, instead of, I don't know, one of the kind of throwaway John songs. Yeah, right. Although I will say I do like, even though Dig It is obviously like, it's like stupid that it's on the album. I like that it kind of lowers your expectations almost. And then it fades right into Let It Be, which is just like even though as much hype and acclaim as it has, to me, it's still maybe their best song. And that just makes that so much more powerful. So I will say I do like some of the off areas for that reason. But you think about some of the songs they were rehearsing and how much, like Backseat of My Car is another one, which been so good to hear that in Beatles album.
Well, you hear in the moment, and I played it on a recent show where they're doing Give Me Some Truth, and it's John and Paul singing it together.
Oh, yeah.
How cool would that have been?
Yeah, and I do like the version on Imagine a lot, pun not intended. I feel like a Beatles version of any of those Imagine songs would have been so much better to hear. And the one song on Plastic Ono Band, I know Look at Me was written in like the Julia and other of those finger picking styles. But I was re-listening to the album this past week, and I feel like the song Love is the one that I could hear the most as a potential Beatles song. If they actually did like a full band arrangement, something about the melodies and the chord progressions or, whatever it is, I feel like that could have been a great Beatles song, but I don't feel that way about really any other tracks on Plastic Ono Band. I feel like they were all meant to be recorded in the fashion that they were and released. They kind of stripped down Lennon's solo setup.
Yeah, I agree. I think they had a lot more visceral power with his voice and those stripped down arrangements, something like Remember or Isolation. Yeah, I think augmenting them, even if you did it sparingly a la Let It Be with other Beatle performances, might almost be distracting because it would make it too pretty.
Yeah, sure. I think so. And the more you think about those things, like one of the things I was thinking about with Plastic Ono Band is how incredibly well sequenced it is in terms of the track listing. The bookend of Mother and My Mummy's Dead is just so great, clearly thought out.
Yeah.
And God being kind of the final litany, the final release. I was the walrus, now I'm John, is just so heartbreaking, coming after 10 songs of disillusionment and pain. But as great as it is, the more I think about them behind the scenes, recording it and like engineering, okay, this song goes here, it almost makes me a little like disappointed, because you like to think of the album as just this thing that emerged from John and is in a state of pain and primal energy. And I also feel the same very similarly about the Derek and the Dominoes album.
Oh, yeah.
That you want to picture that they just were high as a kite and tumbled into a studio and this chaotic sound just poured out of them.
Yeah.
So the more I think about the machinations behind the recordings, almost like the less I like it, or a little more disappointed I am, I guess.
That it was more thought and pre-planning rather than spontaneous emotion and just impulse.
Sure, yeah. Although with All Things Must Pass, it's kind of cool to think about the recording because of the cast of characters that were involved. Is just this huge orchestral sound. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, very majestic is the word they use over and over. And I love the way it ends with "Hear Me, Lord." It's his God, literally and metaphorically, as a summation coming at the end of this big grand journey that you've been taken on. I have to think that Spector might have had a hand in the sequencing of that, but it's George's baby in the end. And so he put it together the way he wanted to.
Yeah, right. That's a great point on that, because there aren't a ton of really overt religious or spiritual references. I mean, obviously, My Sweet Lord and Awaiting You All and Hear Me, Lord, I think those are really the three very overt ones. And it's telling, I think, that he did save. Well, yeah, one was the lead single and one was the pensive album closer.
Right.
So, yeah, that's interesting.
There's that. But he did learn to develop, too, that whole ambiguity of writing a song that can absolutely be a love song to a woman as much as to God. You know, Long, Long, Long being maybe the first example of that. But there's plenty of others throughout his solo career. I love, one of my favorite songs of his ever is Learning How to Love You.
Okay. I'm not sure I'm as familiar. Which album is that one from?
That is the closing track on 33 1/3.
Oh, okay. Excellent.
Yeah. And it's another beautiful, absolutely, if you look at it through the prism of, is he talking about the Lord here, or is he talking about some woman?
Wow. Okay. I'll be adding that one. I absolutely love his second album, Living in the Material World. I would say that is more overt.
Yeah.
A lot of very explicitly religious, but some like Be Here Now is one. Even the song Living in the Material World, although it's a little silly, where he like brings in the little Beatles references and We Got Richie on a Tour. But then he hits you with the Indian influence, the very serene kind of chorus.
Yeah. Maybe
bridge. I don't know what you would call it. That's a terrific one.
Yeah.
In a similar way, I know less of his music that was late 70s and after. I'm less familiar with, but it seems like he progressively lost interest in putting together a kind of masterwork album like he did with All Things. Maybe you disagree, which would be perfectly valid.
Well, no, to circle back to your point, this expressed earlier with All Things Must Pass, having gotten the validation from the world that he was denied while a member of the Beatles, that yes, you are an equal artist. You've got a singular voice. You're doing something special and unique and just amazingly well crafted. He got that out of his system. I think from that point on, he was less interested in playing the commercial game and playing rock star. Yeah, he'd go out on a tour when he did that, but it kind of blew up in his face because he did it at the wrong time in his personal life. He should have done it with 33 1/3 when he was much better situated and delivering the goods, firing on all cylinders. But I don't want to use the word self-indulgent, but I think he was crafting music for his own pleasure pretty much from that point on, up until he decided to work with Jeff Lynne for Cloud 9. It's like, well, maybe I should see what I can do in the commercial marketplace again and make videos and give interviews and all that sort of thing. He, I think, needed to test that he had that capability if he wanted to, and that's when he did it. If you compare it to other things, like he just tosses out Gone Troppo, does zero promotion for it. It dies a death, and there's some fine music on that.
Sure.
Other points in his career, I think, are reflective of what he was going through. And as you allude to with Living in the Material World, it's a much more overtly spiritual album at a point where he was very deeply immersed in that world as, he's dealing with the aftermath of the Bangladesh concert that would tie him up for the next year, getting that all sorted out. His marriage is fraying apart, and that ends up completely falling apart by the time of the Dark Horse tour. That I sort of equate to his Walls and Bridges album. It's his lost weekend, his dark point where he sings about it quite candidly. And then he's got the hoarse voice besides, which gives it extra credibility. Then he pivots into New Romance with Olivia. And so he does this soul album, Extra Texture, which a lot of people point to, it's boring. No, look at it as a soul album. That's how you need to listen to it.
Right.
There's some of the philosophy there, but not to overt God stuff on it. Answers at the end might be an All Things Must Pass outtake in terms of that sort of old George Harrison messaging, but it's a great track. And it's that kind of album. The next album he does is the fun album, 33 1/3, with this song and Crackerbox Palace. And so I think each album had a special character to it. The self-titled one, that's his, in a way, it's his double fantasy. I'm raising my kid. I'm relaxed. I'm on holiday. This is what I'm doing now. And I don't think he had anything he needed to prove to anybody. Either you're a fan or you're not. Either it speaks to you or it doesn't. But it's not like the grand statement that we've alluded to with these 3 albums. I don't think you're right. He has any grand statements at this point going forward.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. All the parallels, Walls and Bridges, I think those were released the same year as well, right?
Yep.
Walls and Bridges and Dark Horse. The double fantasy one, I think the music on George's feels a lot less, I don't want to say contrived, but for me, back to your initial statement on maybe me growing up with less historical connotations, when I listen to double fantasy, it feels a little not genuine. I think part of that is
a bit forced, would you say?
Yeah, really beautiful, beautiful boy. And I actually love the song.
Yeah.
It's a really nice song, but
yeah, I'm speaking more to where he was coming from in terms of John. And again, there's so much spin and self-created mythology attached to that record. It's impossible for me to listen to it objectively at all. I'm glad to hear you say that you, coming from a much later distance, I remember the day it came out. And you came to it years later. John was not alive anymore by the time, you were born into this world and all that stuff. So, but it still strikes you that way. I think it took me years to reach that point where I realized I was being spun. Then you just, in real time in 1980, so happy to hear new John Lennon.
Oh, yeah.
You're willing to accept it, accept Yoko too, and just embrace it. And then sadly, he's killed within weeks of it coming out. So I think that it occupies this unique space of, it will almost never, until maybe the generation alive when it was released dies out, be looked at in the objective way that it should be. And granted, in his lifetime, the initial reviews in that tiny space between its release and his death, there were some pretty critical reviews of it. I love the one from Charles Shar Murray over in England talking about it. Very little of interest to hear to anybody who's not married to Yoko Ono, something like that. I think more what I'm taking from it, if not in the execution, but more the intent of trying to put out a record of a snapshot of where you're at. And yeah, it is undeniably forced. As you say, George was a lot more successful at it because he was living that life. He wasn't married to an artist that wanted equal time on his albums. And, he's just hanging out in Maui doing mushrooms and just this is what comes out of him.
Yeah, sure. No, I think both are in a way kind of all right, the crazy stuff is over.
Yeah.
It's time to settle down. Here's where I'm at, as you said. So
yeah, that's what I'm sort of stumbling toward here and all this.
But it's very funny to see the parallels. And, if I wrote about a 4th album in my piece, it would have been McCartney, which is a lot earlier than these 3, but it's definitely, if you want to tell the full story, I would say he has less to do with Clapton, but you could lean out and look at his story through the 70s. And I wonder if there are parallels there. I mean, he had obviously had way more commercial success. And to me, as just a fan, I think all of them sort of hit a peak by the time 1975 occurred, and at that point, it seems like music, and people that lived through it could speak to it better than me, but it seemed like music had kind of progressed past the Beatles, where you have in the early 70s, these Led Zeppelin 4, Who's Next, Dark Side of the Moon, these kind of rock albums that are sort of changing the dial a little bit from Beatlesy music.
Definitely.
And so by no means does that devalue a lot of the songs those guys made through decades after, which are just terrific to listen to. And even Paul's Venus and Mars, how like kind of absurd some of the lyrics are, is one of the more fun listens you can have.
Especially over the course of an album, from start to finish. It's a very well-crafted listening experience.
Yeah. No, sign me up for the rock show. I'll be there. I hope we get one more tour out of Paul after COVID.
Yeah.
That would be sad to not see again.
I would imagine if Genesis can do it, he'll do it.
Yeah, right. I heard about that. Full circle with Phil Collins allegedly participating in All Things Must Pass, though.
Yes.
I don't really know exactly what the extent of his contribution was.
It was congas on an unused take of Art of Dying.
Okay. Interesting. So was he just in the studio and they said, hey, you want to play some congas?
I think that's how it went down. Yeah. And I'm not even sure if he had joined Genesis yet. I can't remember the timeline, because he was not on their first album or two. I forget if he joined for Trespass or not, but I've told the story on the show before, but it's when it came out 30 years, the anniversary edition where George revamped it, redid the cover, did that new take of My Sweet Lord, and supposedly fixed the crediting on it, because there were things like Peter Frampton, I guess, had been left off the original as well. And Phil was looking for his name and couldn't find it, and was like mildly peevish enough about it to mention it in the press. And I guess George caught wind of that and sent him a tape of his performance, quote unquote. And it was this alternative Art of Dying with congas that the playing was terrible. It was embarrassingly bad on it. He goes, here's your performance, Phil. And he's like, oh my God, all right, thank you for leaving my name off the album. And come to find out what it was George he had Ray Cooper come in and record a deliberately bad performance and overdub it onto there and sent it to Phil as a joke. So
that's incredible. Yeah. I think George may have been the funniest of the Beatles. He had like some of his lines in Hard Day's Night and just in press conferences. That's incredible.
Yeah, it's funny. And it's no accident he's the one that connects with Python.
Right. Yeah. Python. And wasn't one of his last letters a correspondence with like Mike Myers from like Wayne's World and Austin Powers?
Exactly right.
Okay. So yeah. He liked comedy.
He did.
That's funny. Phil Collins. And then the other weird one is, or random one is Peter Frampton, right? Is supposed to be in the mix somewhere on All Things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he, at least before Frampton comes alive and he explodes, of course, he'd been in Humble Pie. He was in The Herd in the late 60s, but he was around, and George and Ringo and he played on other people's sessions. I think there's some Apple stuff that Frampton might have played on. I don't know if it's Doris Troy or Billy Preston, but for sure there was stuff like Harry Nilsson albums, and Frampton plays the lead guitar on Ringo's Dose of Rock and Roll song from Road to Gravere. What else? Trying to think. Oh, he played on John Entwistle solo stuff. So,
oh, really?
Yeah. And he's on Whistle Rhymes, fantastic solo on the song Apron Strings. And then, of course, he got cast in the Sgt. Pepper film.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I don't know much of his work outside of the live album. And even within the live album, probably only like 3 or 4 songs. But still, definitely, I mean, that album sold like 20 million copies or something, which is probably one of the more random multi-platinum records to come out of rock, like just Peter Frampton live album.
His All Things Must Pass. And then, again, this pent-up demand for him to do something after that, which took some time. It's just like George between All Things Must Pass and finally 2 years later coming out with Living in the Material World. With Frampton, it was I'm in You. He comes out with, and Zappa takes a look at the album cover and puts out a song called I Have Been in You.
Yeah, a lot of comedians in the atmosphere at this time.
Some jokes just write themselves.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. No, and then I just learned literally last night that Gary Wright, who played a lot of keyboards, was the Dreamweaver guy.
Yes.
Which is like, how many random connections to this album can there be?
Right. It was anybody in the 70s world. Now, here's your homework assignment. If you have access to the Dick Cavett appearance, George is interviewed in November of 71. You might have seen that. It's fantastic. It's such a great interview.
Is that when he talks about doing drugs, I think, for an extended
he does
clip? Yeah, okay. I have seen parts of that, and it was really good.
So anyway, there's a moment on there where there is a musical act before they bring out George called Wonder Wheel, and it's got Mick Jones, not the Clash Mick Jones, but the one from Foreigner.
Oh, okay.
And he had been in Spooky Tooth.
Okay.
He was in Spooky Tooth with Gary Wright. And so this one-off group called Wonder Wheel, it's Gary Wright. And so you see him singing the song, and George is like in the background with his head hanging down and his hair kind of concealing his face, playing the slide guitar on it.
Oh, my goodness. That's really funny.
Yeah, it's really cool. Those guys had a very big, deep friendship and went to India together in, I want to say, early 72.
Really, yeah. It's funny, you never really hear about India trips other than the India trip, but there's no doubt that George must have gone, countless times over the next several decades, and seeing as it meant so much to him.
Yeah, for sure. And there was even a Beatles collective pre-Rishikesh trip on the 66 tour when they were coming home from the Far East, having gotten beat up in Manila. They stopped off in India and they bought sitars there. And I think they were there for a day before they went back to England.
Wow, I did not know about that either. The other famous India trip that was maybe even before that is, I think that was when the Kinks were there and Ray Davies wrote this song, See My Friends.
Yes.
Which is kind of some Indian influence, which I think you could say is either around the same time or maybe even predates like Norwegian Wood and some of those early sitar songs that the Beatles did, and the Stones one as well, of course.
Yeah, it was some point in 65. It predated Norwegian Wood, which wasn't until the fall. And also that year was the Yardbirds doing Heart Full of Soul, which there's outtakes.
Yeah.
They originally, with Jeff Beck, were trying to record an actual sitar for that, and it didn't work out. But you can hear the outtakes. And eventually he just played his telly like it was a sitar.
Right. So that was Jeff Beck's era of the Yardbirds.
Yep.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then Clapton had come before that?
Yeah. He quit right after 4 Year Love.
Okay.
I think it was Brian Auger who plays the harpsichord on that.
Okay.
And Clapton's like, what am I doing in this band? I started out in a blues band.
Okay.
What the hell am I doing here?
Okay. Interesting. He did love the blues. And then, of course, Page came in, and the rest is history from there, I guess. Then the new Yardbirds came about.
And it's a cool moment at the Twickenham sessions because Glyn Johns is working with them, having just produced the first Zeppelin album. And there's a moment caught on tape where he offers to play it for George and John at lunchtime or something. Check this out, Jimmy Page's new band.
Oh, wow.
George, do you want to hear some of this Jimmy Page album?
Jimmy Page?
Yeah. Just produced an album with his new group.
Is he the one that was in the Yardbirds?
Yeah.
I think is lunch ready?
It's really unbelievable. It's something going on. Oh, but he's really, and it's such a good group at the same time. John Paul Jones on bass.
John Paul
Jones on bass. You don't ever used him in the sessions? He's like the governor. He's very young, he's about 24. Oh, the governor bass.
Whole thing?
Really good. And a kid called John Bowen on drums.
The thing is, I think he was on a second before. I don't feel as though...
Oh, that's so fascinating, yeah. I know you've talked about this one line where they talk about like seeing some Cream performance on TV.
Oh, the farewell show.
Yeah, it's just so funny to hear them just like mentioning these things in casual conversation. Like these guys who 50 years later are going to be the absolute pantheon of rock and roll, which is the defining musical genre of the 20th century and potentially beyond.
Yeah, they're fans of music going on around them. It's so cool hearing that. There's the moment where you've got Paul and Linda keep singing repeatedly "Build Me Up Buttercup" by the Foundations because it's like stuck in their head. And I remember the first time I heard Fleetwood Mac Albatross after years of being accustomed to Abbey Road Sun King. And it's like, holy shit, this is like a direct lift of the sound. Yeah. And come to find out it was the #1 song in England in January of 69.
I know. I can't believe that was a #1 hit, but yeah, I mean, to me, I always just hear Sun King, but that's funny. And it's interesting with those guys talking about the legacies. I feel like almost no classic rock band has aged better, let's say, than like the youngest generation that is teenagers now, than the Lindsey Buckingham, Stevie Nicks, Fleetwood Mac lineup. They seem to have really cemented themselves. I think Rolling Stone just redid their top, some number of albums of all time. Mm-hmm. And Rumors jumped from like something, maybe top 100 to like number 5.
Oh boy.
Greatest album of all time, which I think is just one proxy for how far they've risen.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And in the same list, Sgt. Pepper was demoted from 1 to like 25. So I kind of want to ask the guys, like, what's the process for making this list?
They're behind Jay-Z now or something?
Yeah, probably. Number 1 was Marvin Gaye.
Oh, What's Going On?
What's Going On, yeah, which I think is a little bit of a reach. It's kind of, the song is amazing. Mm-hmm. If it was a best songs list, I would have that up there. But I think, either way, interesting to think about these lists because you'll never really agree, I feel like.
No, they're just snapshots of whatever time they're being produced in.
Right.
It's interesting that I always, once I became aware of it, I found out that Sly Stone directly responded to What's Going On with There's a Riot Going On.
Oh, wow.
That was his Answer album.
Yeah.
And to me, that album is so incredibly ahead of its time. I'm waiting for the day that gets its due.
Yeah, I definitely heard about that on a similar or a different music-related podcast and was blown away when I heard it. But yeah, I think that's he and Marvin Gaye and I think Curtis Mayfield were kind of the 3 trendsetters in like making Motown or soul music more kind of political and social. And yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Curtis Mayfield. Going back to the early 60s, and he's with The Impressions.
Oh, yeah.
People Get Ready.
Yeah. Impressions, is it?
The Impressions, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah. They're from Chicago.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Right. My last trip pre-COVID was to Chicago, by the way, for about 2 days. Oh. The first time I'd ever been there, yeah.
Something About the Beatles. Created and hosted by Robert Rodriguez. Executive producer Rick Way. Title song by the Corgis.
Something about the Beatles.